Hello everyone and welcome to this first ever video about my NFL and college football power rankings. Very interested to talk about this with y'all because, I've been showing these power rankings to a lot of people and a lot of people have been wondering, wait, how in the heck are you determining these scores for these teams? Well, here's exactly how it's working. So what we have here is we have pulled up the current power rankings math that I have for the teams in the NFL right now. You can look at all these teams and how good they are. You can see their offensive points for, their defensive points against, and some other metrics that I have listed here. Now you might be looking over here, and this is the actual numbers I use to determine my power rankings. Now, this is the entire sheet, and there's a lot to talk about here. But first, I'm going to talk about how this power rankings even started. So a while back, I was in this league. It was a simulation league on YouTube, and I was trying to think of a way to come up with power rankings in order to figure out how I was going to rank the teams, because I wanted to see among the people who were part of the league what teams were really the best. And I came up with this equation, and it was a lot of fun. And the equation has massively evolved over time in order to make it so that it stays compatible throughout the season and you don't have to keep editing the formula and editing the formula and editing the formula. Instead, you can just input the data and you don't have to edit the formula each time to make it more accurate to what you want. So what I currently have is I have this as the current formula for my power rankings, which you can see this is the key up here. This WPCT is our winning percentage. Opponents' games played, that's this. Opponents' winning percentage, that's this. Point differential is right here, and this is strength of schedule. We will get back to strength of schedule, but let's look through the score ranking. This is what I use to determine. This is the first step in determining the power ranking of your team. So the first thing that we do is you have winning percentage minus 0.5. Now you might be wondering, why do we subtract 0.5? Well, the reason for that is because the winning percentage is on a scale from 1 to 0. Now, for these power rankings, I thought that it would be a good idea if instead of having like 0 be the bench, like the 0 be the bottom of the barrel, what if 0 was instead the average? So I have 0 as the average in the power rankings, and everything is weighted around 0, going from all the way up to like, there's no limit on how high it can be, but it's basically around like the best that you typically will see is around like the high 25 range, possibly, and the lowest you'll see is maybe in the low 20s, is in the low negative 20s. That's basically the range that we have here. So that's why the winning percentage is you subtract 0.5, because it takes it from a scale. The scale goes from being from 1 to 0, as opposed to now the scale is 0.5 to negative 0.5. So now it's on a simple scale where we can work with that. Now the maximum you get is a 0.5 and the minimum you get is a negative 0.5. Now what we have here is we have opponents' games played. Now opponents' games played is interesting because it's pretty much the same for every team, specifically at least in the NFL, because games in the NFL are so standard across leagues, and like it's always very simple. But that's basically how it works in the NFL. Is games across the league are so standard and the majority of teams play the same amount. After this week, the bye weeks will be over and these numbers should all be the same. Oh yeah, ignore these down here actually, because these are actually, move this across there. That's much better now. See, now you can see that it's actually accurate. Beforehand, it was inaccurate, but now these are accurate. But the point is that typically in the NFL, every team plays 16 games, and no matter how many opponents you play, the structure of your schedule is extremely standard, which means that your opponents play pretty much the same amount of games as you do, and that's how this metric comes to be. So opponents' wins and opponents' losses create opponents' winning percentage. Now, I will get back later into exactly how I came up with opponents' winning percentage and opponents' losses, but just know that if you take the amount of games your opponents play against not you, so every other game they play, that's basically your opponent's games played. So, and that's pretty standard across teams. So you would be able to use that as a simple multiplier to basically turn this minuscule decimal into a broad scale of about however many teams there is. And then this multiply by 5 here is basically just weighting it across the other metrics. You'll see when we get here to 3.5 the reason why that's the case. So next up, we have this chunk right here. And that would be opponent's winning percentage minus 0.5. Now, we will talk about opponent's winning percentage right now, actually. So the way that opponent's winning percentage works is that I take every team that you've played against, and I add up all of your wins. But then what I do is I subtract the amount of losses you've had. The reason I subtract the amount of losses your team has had is because I want to take the wins your opponents have had and make them independent of the games against you. Because of course, if they beat you, then you have a loss. So if they win against you, then you have a loss. As you can see here with the Chiefs lost to the Raiders this season. So we're counting all these wins by all the teams they've played against, except that one loss against the Raiders. That would be all of the wins against them. Same thing here. If you're looking at the Jets here, who have lost all of their games this season, every team that they're here against, every team on this chart that they're against, you're counting only the games that they've played against other teams, basically. Now, it's not exact. Well, it's essentially doing what I'm telling you to do, but it's not actually, it doesn't know that's what it's doing, but that's essentially what it's doing. If we look at losses here, it's the exact same thing. In terms of losses, it's another simple concept here where you take all the losses of your opponents except for the times that they lost to you. That makes it independent of their games against you. And the reason why making that independent of games against you is so important is because that can skew something. If you have two teams, let's say, how about this one? Let's look at the Jets and the Saints. The Jets have an opponent's winning percentage of 42 and 33. The Saints have one of 43 and 34. They're about the same. 558 opponents winning percentage and 560 opponents winning percentage. However, if I was to include the games that they played against the Jets and the Saints, it would be a different story. However, their strength of schedules would qualify as basically the same on this level because of the fact that against all the other teams in the league, their opponents are basically the same. And that's what the whole point of that is to make the opponent's strength of schedule independent of the teams that you play. Now, of course, the same thing that I have here is opponent's winning percentage. Basically, you take the wins and you divide it by the total games played, and you get this. And that's simple enough there. Now, the opponent's winning percentage is the same thing as we had beforehand, where opponent's winning percentage minus 0.5 is in order to weight it from being 100 to 0. And instead of 100 to 0, now we have it as a case of, as opposed to 100 to 0, or no, not 100 to 0. As opposed to 1 to 0, we have it as 0.5 to negative 0.5. That way we can make it so that instead of the minimum being 0, the average is 0. So now we have it as opponents' games played. That's the same thing here. That just keeps both of these metrics, the winning percentage and the opponent's winning percentage, on an even playing field. And then the last thing is we multiply it by 3.5. Now, I talked earlier about how the score was winning percentage was multiplied by 5. Why is the opponent's winning percentage multiplied by 3.5? Well, that's because I think that that's a simple ratio that basically values how much those two parts of football are really important to determining how good a team is. I think that if you were thinking of a ratio of about how important your personal record is as opposed to your strength of schedule, I would put it at about that ratio of 5 to 3.5. I think that a 5 to 3.5 ratio is pretty fair in determining how important winning percentage is versus the quality of your opponents. Now, the last piece in this first score metric is point differential. Now, point differential is different from opponent's winning percentage or even winning percentage because it's already weighted across 0. As you can see here, it's already weighted across 0, so you don't have to do anything to it. All of these point differentials are already weighted across 0, so we already know, regardless, that we're getting what we want out of this. Now, the reason why then we take the opponent's games played divided by 200 is because point differential, unlike the other two, metrics here, starts as a whole number, and you want to make it so that it's the least important, but still have a factor on the score. So that's why this is the case. Oh, I have this wrong here. That's opponent's games played. That's not opponent's winning percentage. That's opponent's games played. Sorry. Yeah, right? Yes. These are opponent's games played, not opponent's winning percentage. But the same thing still stands here, is we're multiplying this by opponent's games played divided by 200, and what this usually comes out to is that this can have like a factor of about improving your score by 1 or dropping your score by -1 and not much more, which is basically how much we want this to really affect it. Now, the last piece here is opponent's games played divided by 5 as the full divisor of this entire equation. And the reason for that is simply because the reason why we divide it by opponent's games played divided by 5 is because I wanted to keep it central to the entire equation. Everything else here is multiplied by opponent's games played. Every other piece here is multiplied by opponent's games played. So I wanted the full thing to be divided by opponent's games played in order to keep it standard and structured so that it doesn't change over time. That way the metric doesn't become outdated. That's the main value there, is that the metric is going to stay standard and it's going to stay consistent over time. So that's the first step here. That's the score metric. How much time are we into this? 12 minutes? Okay, that's good. About 13 minutes. That's nice. So now what we're going to look at is what's called the strength of schedule metric. Now, the strength of schedule metric, as we see right here, is the sum of the scores of all of your opponents. That's what we have right here. And as you can see, that's the SOS right here. All of your opponents of the teams that you've played are all right here. And that's basically how that works. Now, the importance of strength of schedule is that it actually is what is used going into the next piece. So what we have here is we have this metric listed here called peripheral. Now, this metric doesn't actually have any effect on the ranking, but it just shows us a thought concept into this is just a proof of concept of what is coming next. And what is coming next here is showing us what exactly this is. So you might see that mostly this is the same thing. However, there's one minor little piece that's different. As opposed to opponent's winning percentage being factored in. See, opponent's winning percentage is not highlighted. Opponent's winning percentage is not factored in this equation. The only thing that is factored in this equation, as opposed to opponent's winning percentage, is actually strength of schedule. So we take strength of schedule, and then we have this thing called the multiplier, which you'll see right here. SOS times multiplier, right there. Now, what is SOS times multiplier? Well, SOS is pretty simple. We've already seen SOS is strength of schedule, and strength of schedule is the sum of all the scores of all of your opponents. So that's simple enough, and we see that the SOS is calculated across here. But what is the multiplier? The multiplier actually is this thing over here, which is currently listed as 0.85. The way that I do the multiplier is that I take the first score. Basically, the first score here is this is the chunk of the first score that is based off opponent's winning percentage. And this is the chunk of the peripheral that is based off strength of schedule. And what I do is I subtract them from each other and I take the standard deviation and I try and figure out how to get the smallest standard deviation across all of these. And when I get the smallest standard deviation, I have found a way to make the least deviant metric so that these two have basically a similar impact. That's the whole goal here. If I can find the lowest standard deviation possible, I have basically found a centralized ranking across, or a centralized multiplier across each of the teams that makes all of these teams standard. Once again, because if I was just to basically take the peripheral and I was going to be like, oh, I want to make it so that this one, there's no standard deviation here, and this one, there's no, then basically you're multiplying it by a bunch of different things, and you're basically doing either nothing or you're doing worse than nothing, and you're making it so that you basically are having a bias across them to where the peripheral is no longer valuable. You want to make it so that you have the lowest standard deviation across all of these numbers in order to make the multiplier have effect, but have the minimum possible effect, or make it the least deviant so that everything is regressing towards the mean. That's the whole goal here, is regression towards the mean. So now that we have taken care of looking at that, we can now look and see that this second score right here is basically just the peripheral plus the score divided by 2. So it's the average of the peripheral and the score, which we see over here because this right here, this piece, all of this right here, is essentially the peripheral. All of this right here, everything in this numerator and denominator right here, not the 2, but everything from here is essentially the peripheral. So what you're taking is the first score plus the first peripheral, and you add those together and you divide it by 2 to get the second score. Now, what happens here is you actually just keep going through. So now that you have your second score metric, you've adjusted it a little bit, and you move on. The second strength of schedule is the same as before. Now you take the sum of all of the second scores against the teams you've played. Then you use this second strength of schedule in your next peripheral using the same multiplier as before in order to add more regression towards the mean, and so on and so forth, using the third strength of schedule as the sum of the thirds, using the fourth strength to create the fourth score, the fourth strength of schedule as the sum of all the fourth scores to create the fifth score, and so on, and eventually we get to the end with the seventh score. Now, why do I feel comfortable using the seventh score? Well, it's because of this. Look, 0.01 standard deviation across. That basically means that it's as close to central as possible, which basically means that I use this as the score in order to determine which teams are which. And I actually just noticed a minor error here. I should flip the Falcons and the Broncos. So I will take care of that. And now we have our scores back and simple. I will make this. Sometimes I have to extend one out in order to realize which number is actually higher. All of these are in the right place. But basically, that explains how this metric works for the NFL. I'm going to make a cut, and in the next video, I'm going to talk about how this works for college football. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.